She has no idea what she's doing. She never did. My brother's voice bounced off the glass walls of the conference room like he owned every square inch of it. And to be fair, he thought he did. He stood at the head of the long walnut table, one hand gripping the back of the chair, the other sweeping dramatically toward me like I was an exhibit in a museum of failure. "Look at her," he said to the room full of attorneys and estate accountants and my mother dabbing at her eyes in the corner. "She hasn't contributed a single dollar to this family's legacy. She's been playing around in some office somewhere, doing what, exactly? Nobody even knows." He laughed, and two of the junior attorneys laughed with him, because that's what you do when the man cutting your check decides something is funny. I sat with my hands flat on the table, my breathing even, my expression somewhere between mildly interested and completely unbothered. I did not look at my brother. I looked at the small scratch on the surface of the table, just to the left of the ownership transfer documents he'd slid in front of me 20 minutes ago, the ones he wanted me to sign. Daniel had been talking for 11 minutes. I know because I checked my phone at the start and made a mental note. My attorney had told me to let him talk. Give him all the rope he needs, she'd said. I had given him a whole hardware store. "Our family's company," he continued, pacing now, Hargrove Innovations, was built by Dad's hands and my hands. I have run this company for 6 years. I have grown revenue by 40%. I have secured the partnerships that kept the lights on while Maya was off finding herself, or whatever it is she's been doing in that apartment in Austin that none of us have ever visited. He said Austin the way some people say mistake. I had not corrected him about the apartment. I let him believe I still lived there. My attorney, Patricia, sat 2 chairs down from me. She had not opened her folder. She was waiting. The lead estate attorney, a silver-haired man named Gerald, who had handled my father's affairs for 20 years, cleared his throat and looked up from his reading glasses. He looked directly at my brother. "Daniel," he said carefully, "before we proceed to the signatures, I need to ask you something." He set down his pen. "Do you know who currently holds the controlling interest in Meridian Venture Group?" My brother's pacing stopped. He turned around slowly, with the kind of confidence that only exists right before it collapses. "Of course," he said. "Meridian is our anchor investor. They hold 18% of Hargrove. They've been with us since the Series B." Gerald nodded once. "And do you know who founded Meridian?" My brother opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes slid sideways to me, just for a half second, then snapped back to Gerald. "Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I want to know who's in this with me tonight." The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and the afternoon sun was cutting hard through the west-facing windows, throwing long gold lines across the carpet. I watched one of those lines inch toward the edge of the table while my brother regrouped. He adjusted his jacket. He picked up his coffee mug even though it was empty. He set it back down. He was stalling, and everyone in the room could see it, but nobody said anything because we were all watching the same thing, and some moments deserve the silence they earn. I did not always sit quietly in rooms where people were making decisions about my life. There was a version of me, about 4 years ago, who would have been halfway out of her chair by now, voice raised, face hot, making every single point Daniel had just made about her look exactly as true as he wanted it to look. That version of me lost. Every time. Not because she was wrong, but because she was loud, and Daniel was strategic, and our father, God rest him, always sided with whoever appeared, more composed. I learned that lesson the hard way at a dinner table in Connecticut when I was 26, and Daniel was 31, and he had just been named acting CEO of Hargrove Innovations, while I was still finishing my master's in intellectual property law. Dad had poured himself a second glass of wine and looked at me across the breadth of that absurdly long table and said, "Maya, I hope you understand that this is a meritocracy. Daniel has shown up. He has put in the time. I need someone in that chair who the board respects." I remember the way the word meritocracy sat in my chest like something I'd accidentally swallowed. I had graduated summa cum laude. I had clerked for a federal judge for 2 years. I had published 2 papers on IP licensing structures that were cited in actual case law. I had applied for the position at Hargrove 3 times over 4 years, and been told each time that the timing wasn't right, or that the board wasn't ready for a transition, or once, memorably, that my approach was too academic for a company that lived in the real world. Daniel had been handed the position on a Tuesday over a steak dinner I wasn't invited to. I did not argue with my father that night. I poured myself a glass of wine and asked about the garden, and drove home the next morning, and incorporated Meridian Venture Group the following week. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds calculated. It was. But let me be precise about something, because precision matters in the version of this story where I actually get to tell it. I did not start Meridian to destroy my brother. I started it because I was 30 years old, and I was done waiting for a door to open from the inside when I had a perfectly good key in my pocket. I had spent 5 years building a client list in IP licensing. I had money saved. I had a partner, my college roommate Dara, who was a financial analyst with more patience and sharper instincts than anyone I have ever met. We were ready. We built something real, and we built it without asking anyone in my family for a single dollar. And if my brother's company happened to be one of the firms we evaluated as a potential investment target, well, I knew the asset base better than anyone. Daniel had no idea Meridian was me. I had set it up through a registered agent in Delaware, same as every other mid-size venture fund, with Dara listed as managing partner in all the public filings. My name appeared nowhere in anything you could find with a standard search. Our attorneys handled all communication with Hargrove's board. The wire transfers came from a trust account. Daniel had pitched Meridian's partners in a glass-walled room very much like this one, 2 years ago, with a slide deck that included a photo of himself shaking hands with someone important at a conference. And he had been charming and confident, and completely unaware that the woman who had reviewed his cap table and approved the term sheet was his sister. I had watched the recording later. I had found nothing in it that surprised me. What I had found, about 8 months after that investment closed, was the patent issue. This was the part that changed the shape of everything. Hargrove's primary product line, the inventory management software that accounted for 62% of their revenue, was built on a compression algorithm. A very specific compression algorithm that had been developed by a startup called ClearPath Systems in 2019. ClearPath had gone under in 2021. Before they dissolved, they had sold their entire IP portfolio in a distressed asset auction. I had been watching that auction because that is the kind of thing I do for a living. I had bought the portfolio for $430,000, which at the time felt like a moderately interesting long-term bet on some solid foundational tech. It was not until Dara sent me Hargrove's product specifications for due diligence that I realized Daniel's flagship software had been running on my algorithm for 3 years without a licensing agreement, not because he knew, because nobody had checked. The original ClearPath founders had licensed it verbally, which is a legal fiction, and when ClearPath dissolved, the license dissolved with it. My brother had been sitting on an unlicensed IP liability large enough to invalidate his last 2 funding rounds if anyone looked closely enough, and I looked closely. I spent 6 weeks confirming everything. I had 3 separate IP attorneys review the chain of title. They all came back with the same conclusion. I owned it. Hargrove owed royalties on every unit of software they had shipped since 2021. At the standard licensing rate for foundational compression tech, that number was somewhere north of $2.8 million. My brother had been building his meritocracy on a foundation he did not own. I did not send a cease and desist. I filed the paperwork correctly, locked the ownership into a clean trust structure, and I waited. I waited because my father's health had been declining, and I was not going to weaponize a legal position while he was still alive. That is not the kind of person I am, even when the people I love do not extend me the same courtesy. My father passed 4 months ago. He was not a bad man. He was a man who found it easier to believe in the version of his family that required the least revision. I miss him. And I have made peace with that. The will was, predictably, complicated. Daniel had been working on it for 2 years, in consultation with estate attorneys, who were technically representing the estate, but who had been introduced to my father by Daniel, and who had Daniel's cell phone number saved as a contact. The document that came out of that process left Daniel with 70% of Hargrove shares, and left me with a sum of money that was not nothing, but was also, very clearly, the amount a person leaves when they want to be able to say they left something. There was a provision that required my signature on an ownership restructuring agreement before the shares could be formally transferred. Without my signature, the process stalled. Daniel had called this meeting to get the signature. He had expected it to take 40 minutes. He had now been talking for 17 minutes, and he had not gotten anywhere near the signature. "Gerald," he said finally, his voice taking on the smooth authority he used with clients and subordinates. "I'm not sure what Meridian's founding structure has to do with Dad's estate. They're separate matters." Gerald removed his reading glasses entirely. He set them on the folder in front of him with a small, deliberate click. "They are not separate," he said. "They are in fact directly connected, because Miss Hargrove has submitted documentation to this office indicating that she holds a controlling interest in Meridian Venture Group, which as you noted holds 18% of Hargrove Innovations, which is the primary asset being transferred under this will." The room went very still. Daniel turned to look at me for the first time since the meeting started. Really looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not smile. I did not need to. "That's..." he started, then stopped. He tried again. "That's not possible." He said it the way people say things they are hoping will become true, if stated with sufficient conviction. "Maya doesn't have the capital to run a venture fund. She's an IP attorney." He looked at Patricia, my attorney, as if she might confirm this for him. Patricia opened her folder for the first time. "Maya," he said, and now his voice had shifted from authority to something closer to a warning. "What is this?" I looked at the scratch on the table again. Then I looked at my brother. I have been waiting a long time to speak in this room, so I was not going to waste the moment on anything less than what was necessary. "I founded Meridian with my own capital and a co-founder in January 4 years ago," I said. My voice was even, not loud. The room was quiet enough that I didn't need volume. "We have been an investor in Hargrove for 2.5 years. I reviewed your pitch personally, although you didn't know that. You did very well, by the way. The slides were good. Something moved across his face that I did not have a word for. It was not quite anger, and it was not quite fear, and it was not quite the look of a man who has just understood something catastrophic. It was all three of those things happening at the same time in a face that had not been designed to contain them simultaneously. You, he said. Dara is our public-facing managing partner, I continued. That is standard practice for funds where one of the partners has a potential conflict of interest with a portfolio company. We disclose the structure correctly in all our regulatory filings. You can verify that. Gerald has already verified that. Patricia slid a copy of the Meridian Incorporation documents across the table, along with 2 years of fund filings and the original term sheet that Daniel's own board had signed. My brother did not pick up the papers. He looked at Gerald instead. This is, he started, and I could hear him searching for the word, unprecedented. He is a man who, when cornered, reaches for vocabulary as a weapon. This is a clear conflict of interest. She invested in the company she's now claiming an inheritance stake in. That creates grounds for a legal challenge. He turned to his own attorneys, 2 men in identical blue suits who had been very quiet for the last 4 minutes. Tell here. You can challenge this. The senior of the 2 attorneys, a man named Holt who I had researched before this meeting, shifted in his chair. Daniel, he said carefully. The investment predates the estate proceedings by over 2 years. The conflict of interest argument would require establishing that the investment was made with the intent to manipulate the inheritance. And given the timeline, that's going to be a very difficult position to. Daniel cut him off. She manipulated the whole thing. He was on his feet again. She hid her identity from the board. She hid it from Dad. She hid it from me for 2 years while she was, gathering information? He looked back at me. This is entrapment. You lured our company into a deal so you could leverage it against the estate. I let him finish. I had expected this argument. It was, in a technical sense, the most sophisticated argument available to him, which meant it was also the first one he would reach for, and reaching for it first would cost him. I did not hide my identity, I said. Meridian disclosed its full ownership structure to your board's legal counsel during due diligence, as required. If your board's legal counsel did not surface that information to you, that is a question you should ask your board's legal counsel. I paused. I also want to note that this meeting was called to obtain my signature on a transfer document. I have not signed anything. I have simply provided documentation that was relevant to the estate proceedings. I have not done anything to your company, Daniel. His jaw tightened. You're trying to use your position in Meridian to block the transfer. I'm entitled to legal counsel and the right to review any document before I sign it. I looked at him. That is not an unusual position for a person to take. My mother made a small sound in the corner. She had been very quiet, which was unusual for her, but she had also known about this meeting's purpose for 3 weeks and had called me exactly once in that time to ask if I was sure I wanted to make things complicated. I had told her I wasn't making anything complicated. I was simply making things accurate. Daniel pointed at me across the table. Sign the documents, Maya. Dad wanted this. You know he wanted this. This company is my life's work. He built it, and I built it, and you walked away from this family, and now you want to parachute back in with some fun nobody has ever heard of and act like you've earned something. He was breathing hard. You haven't earned anything. You've been hiding in Austin doing whatever it is you do while I have been here. Every day. Every board meeting. Every all hands. Every crisis. Where were you? I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the dinner table in Connecticut. I thought about the word meritocracy. I thought about the 3 applications I had submitted and the 3 times the timing wasn't right. I thought about driving home the next morning and sitting in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for about 12 minutes before I went inside and started making calls. I was in Austin, I said. Building something. I reached into the leather portfolio in front of me and removed a single document. I slid it across the table toward my brother. While I was building that something, I said, I also acquired an IP portfolio from a dissolved company called ClearPath Systems, a 2019 compression algorithm. I watched him read the cover page. I watched the moment he understood what he was looking at. The color change happened slowly, like weather moving in. I want to be transparent about something, I continued, because I don't want there to be any confusion about my intentions. Hargrove's primary product line has been operating on unlicensed IP since early 2021. That is not an accusation. It is a title chain issue that your team almost certainly did not know about, but it is a liability that exists regardless of intent. Daniel's hand came down flat on the document. This is a shakedown. It is a licensing conversation, I said. One that I have been prepared to have for several months. I did not bring it into this room to use as leverage. I brought it into this room because Gerald asked me to bring all relevant documentation to today's meeting. I looked at Gerald, who nodded without expression. Patricia slid a second document across to Holt. This is a proposed licensing structure, she said. Standard rates, 3-year term, retroactive to 2021. It's fair, and it's auditable, and it is substantially more favorable than what Miss Hargrove would receive if this went to litigation. Holt picked it up. He read the first page. He put it down and picked up his own phone and turned slightly away from the table. Daniel was still standing. He was looking at the IP document with the expression of a man trying to locate the emergency exit in a room that doesn't have one. Then something shifted in his face. A decision. He straightened up. He buttoned his jacket. He turned to Gerald. "File an emergency injunction," he said. "Freeze the estate proceedings pending a full audit of Meridian's disclosures. We're challenging the fund structure and the IP claim simultaneously." He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I recognized from childhood, from every argument we had ever had in that house, a particular quality of absolute refusal to be wrong. "You want to fight, Maya?" he said softly. "Okay, let's have a fight. You don't have the resources for a protracted legal battle, and I do. I will tie this up for 3 years and you'll walk away with less than Dad left you in the first place." He thought that was the move. He had done the math on my resources the way he had always done the math on me, based on the information he had, which was not all the information there was. He knew about the Austin apartment. He knew about the IP practice. He knew about Meridian's 18% stake. He did not know about the other thing. Patricia reached into her folder one last time. She removed a single sheet and placed it in front of Gerald. "Before we discuss litigation timelines," she said pleasantly, "there is one additional item for the record." She looked at Daniel. "Are you familiar with a company called Stratford Dynamics?" My brother blinked. "Stratford is our biggest client. They account for 31% of Hargrove's annual revenue. What about them?" Patricia smiled the way she always smiles when she already knows the answer to the question she's about to ask. "Are you familiar with who holds the parent company trust for Stratford Dynamics?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. The earlier silences had been tense. This one was almost peaceful, the way the air gets after a storm has finished and before anyone has gone outside to assess. Gerald picked up the sheet Patricia had placed in front of him. He read it. He set it down. He looked at my brother over the top of his glasses. "The Stratford Dynamics Parent Trust," he said, "is held by a holding company registered in Nevada. The beneficial owner of that holding company, confirmed by the trust's registered agent in a letter dated last Thursday, is Maya Hargrove." My brother sat down. He did not choose to sit down. His legs simply made the decision for him. I did not inherit Stratford. I need to say this clearly because the way these things get retold can get distorted. Stratford Dynamics was a client I had represented in a licensing dispute 3 years ago. As part of the settlement structure, they had offered an equity stake in lieu of partial fees, which is unusual but not unprecedented when a company is cash-constrained, and the IP at stake is significant. I had taken the equity. I had watched the company grow. 18 months ago, their founders had approached me about a buyout of their parent structure, and I had facilitated it through the Nevada holding company, because that was the cleanest way to handle the tax position. I was not engineering a siege of my brother's company. I was doing my job. My job just happened to intersect with his life in ways he had never noticed, because he had never once in 34 years of knowing me thought to look. "Stratford's contract with Hargrove comes up for renewal in 60 days, Patricia said to the room. "We're not here to threaten anything. We're here to have an honest conversation." Daniel's face had gone through too many things in the last 10 minutes to track. He was looking at the table now, both hands resting on top of the IP document, and he looked, for the first time in my memory, like someone who was genuinely uncertain what to do next. Holt leaned over and said something quietly into his ear. Daniel shook his head once. Holt said something else. Daniel looked up at me. "You planned all of this," he said. His voice was quieter now. That was more unsettling than the shouting had been. "You spent 4 years building a trap and you put Dad's company in the middle of it." "I did not plan for Dad to die," I said. "The rest of it? Yes. I built things. That's what I do. I have been building things for 4 years with my own capital and my own effort and my own name, even when my name wasn't visible." I looked at him. "I didn't do this to destroy you, Daniel. I did this so that when we sat down in a room like this one, you would have to talk to me like a person." He laughed. It came out hollow, like he was testing the sound of it. "You want me to respect you? After this? I want the company our father built to be run by someone who understands its actual asset base and its actual liabilities," I said. "And I want a seat at that table that I didn't have to inherit from someone else's generosity." I looked at Gerald. "I am prepared to propose a restructured governance arrangement, one that reflects the actual distribution of risk and ownership across all the entities we've discussed today. It is a fair structure. Patricia has the outline. I'm not asking for control. I'm asking for accuracy." Holt took the folder. Patricia slid across to him. He opened it. He read. He leaned over to the other blue-suited attorney, and they had a conversation in whispers that lasted about 90 seconds. My mother spoke for the first time. She had put down the tissue. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen her wear before. Something between bewilderment and something I wanted very much to call recognition. "Maya," she said softly, "why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her. "Because telling you would have meant asking permission," I said. "And I wasn't willing to do that again. Nobody said anything for a while. Outside the window, 14 floors down, the city was doing what it always does, indifferent and continuous. I thought about a parking lot in Austin 4 years ago and a woman sitting in a car deciding what kind of person she was going to be. I thought about my father's garden, which he had loved, and which he had tended himself even when his hands started to shake. I thought about the word meritocracy, and how long I had carried it. Holt looked up from the folder. He addressed Gerald. He said that his client would need 72 hours to review the proposed governance structure before any substantive response, which is the most honest thing anyone on that side of the table had said all afternoon. Gerald wrote something down. Patricia closed her folder. My brother was still sitting, his jacket slightly rumpled now, his hands no longer on the documents. I gathered my portfolio. I stood up. I didn't look at Daniel when I said what I said next. I said it to Gerald, and I said it to the room. I'm not here to take anything that isn't mine, I said. I am here to stop signing away things that are. I left before anyone else moved. Patricia caught up with me in the elevator lobby. She said the governance proposal was strong and she thought they'd accept it within the week. I told her I knew. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a while before I started the engine. Not because I was upset. I was not upset. I sat there because I had been moving toward that room for 4 years, and something about arriving at a destination makes you want to stay still for a moment and just be in the fact of it. I called Dara. She answered on the second ring. She said, well? I said, we're fine. She said she'd open the good coffee. I told her not to bother with anything fancy. She said too late. That night I did something I had been putting off for longer than I should have. I took the photo of the 3 of us, me and Daniel and my father on the dock at the summer house, off my phone's lock screen. I moved it to a folder. I didn't delete it. That's not what any of this was about. This was never about erasing anything. This was about writing something new on top of a page that had been written for me by someone else, and writing it so clearly and so carefully that it could not be contested. My father used to say that the family you build is the truest thing you have. I think he meant that as a comfort. I took it as instructions. I drove home to the loft in Chicago that my brother had no idea I'd bought 18 months ago. Not because I was hiding it, because he had never asked. I made tea, and I stood at the window for a long time looking at the street below, and the silence felt like something I had paid for, which I suppose in every way that matters, I had.